I will just give it another minute or so. The number of participants is growing rapidly. So we'll just give it a minute or a minute and a half max, and then we'll get going. Okay, I think we'll get started. Thanks for joining. Welcome everybody to the fourth in a series of WEFI Nexus policy webinars. I am Jonathan Lautze. I'm a research group leader.
Okay, so I leave the link.
Sorry, Sylvester, can you mute your microphone? Yeah, thanks. So as noted, this is the fourth in a series of Nexus policy webinars. The focus of the discussion today is transboundary multi-stakeholder platforms. What do we know and where should we go? Before we dive into the specific focus of today, I just wanted to provide a bit of context that this work has emerged from 3 years of Nexus Gains activities and 1 year of Nexus policy gain activity and engagement in the Incomati River Basin. So if this is there's people watching, joining from other regions today, and you're wondering where exactly the Incomati Basin is, you can look at that map in the bottom right of your screen there. The Incomati is a relatively small basin, small shared basin in the southeast corner of Africa. It's small, but it packs quite a big punch in terms of the lessons that can be derived from it globally. So it's kind of with that spirit in mind that we engaged on 4 years of working in Incomati, focused mainly on 2 activities. So the first activity that was undertaken over the last few years, this was very much in partnership with the University of Manchester in the UK, was focused on river basin modeling. So we spent we were just focused on river basin modeling to inform transboundary reallocation discussions as part of what's called an interim Incomati Maputo agreement, which was completed in 2002. So we had a first activity centered around river basin modeling. We also had an activity which was going to be the focus of today, which was centered on transboundary multi-stakeholder platform development. As I flagged, this was a 4-year engagement, starting in early 22 and then really wrapping up at the end of this year in a couple months. We've had in the past, if you guys have followed Nexus Gains, we in the past in 2023 had a webinar on the modeling activity. And in 2024, we had a webinar on the MSP activity. We also have a number of blogs, which you can find on the Nexus Gains website. And then the publication pipeline has started to bear fruit. We had our first one published in July of this year and 2 more in the pipeline. To dive very briefly into what was done, the river basin modeling, you heard me just mention that. So this was quite a robust data collection effort, partnering with the 3 country governments that share the Incomati, that's Eswatini, South Africa, Mozambique. For over a year, we collected data on a range of parameters and then used it to formulate a model, a river basin model in PyWare, Python Water Resources. We engaged young professionals in that process, and they played a key role in data collection and getting capacitated on PyWare. We had a steering committee help us identify key questions that we'd use the model to respond to. Really, a lot of those key questions centered on the potential to change a minimum transboundary flow threshold. So we ran scenarios on that. You can see them in the bottom right of your screen there, looking at different options like increasing the transboundary flow, protecting the estuary, and also some storage development options. And it really, I think, gained a lot of attention. It was featured, and you see the image of the cover page of the UNEC Transboundary Water Allocation Summary Handbook. This work in the Incomati was featured there. Because it was considered to be a significant example of water reallocation. So allocation has been done, but actually taking an existing allocation and updating it is not that common. But there may be increasing need to do that given climate change and other evolving issues. So this, what's happening in Incomati was an example of that, that we like to think we work to support as part of Nexus Gains and later Nexus Policy Gains. So we had one activity on that. The second activity, as I mentioned earlier, and this is the feature of today, on transboundary multi-stakeholder platforms. And we really, through this activity, wanted to support INMACOM, which is the Incomati Maputo Watercourse Commission, a river basin organization for the Incomati and a neighboring basin called the Maputo. We wanted to support INMACOM in the design of an MSP. So we reviewed literature, we fostered lesson exchange across other basins, and some key stakeholders from those other basins are going to serve in the panel today. And then we mined those experiences and engaged with the Incomati Maputo Watercourse Commission and other stakeholders to support the co-design of a multi-stakeholder platform. So that was, we think, quite a success. But through this process, I think we also identified that we don't know that much about a couple key issues at least. So one of them is transboundary MSPs, the central focus of today's webinar. In terms of, like, for example, identifying how many transboundary MSPs there are globally. Couldn't answer that question, still can't. And then in terms of the process of developing them, what are the steps to get there in a basin without one? There wasn't really guidelines on how to do this. So it was kind of an iterative process in our case. So we feel like we kind of stumbled in some interesting knowledge gaps. And those knowledge gaps, we hope, will help motivate some of the discussion that takes place in this webinar. So in terms of the agenda, I hope to keep myself very brief. I think we're about 7 minutes in to just provide a welcome and framing from me, Jonathan. And then we'll move into a couple presentations. First from Ryan Nehring at IFPRI, who's going to talk about distilling lessons from three transboundary MSP cases. And then we're going to hear from Sindy Mthimkhulu, the Executive Secretary of INMACOM, who's going to talk about the process of developing an MSP there and also the actual design. What did that look like? And then we're going to move into a panel discussion, hopefully around the halfway point of this webinar. And we're going to hear from three really impressive panelists. The first is Patience Mukuyu from WaterAid. The second is Dr. Loreen Katiyo from the Global Water Partnership. And the last is Engineer Sylvester Matemu from the Nile Basin Discourse. And I think we'll have some really interesting and fruitful discussion there. And then we'll close out with some final words from Ryan Nehring at IFPRI. So that's a bit of framing. I do believe I kept myself relatively brief. I'm going to stop sharing, and I think we're going to move quickly into our first presenter, which is Ryan Nehring. I'd ask Ryan to share share your screen while I'm introducing you. So Ryan Nehring is a research fellow in the Natural Resources and Resilience Unit at IFPRI, whose research focuses on the political economy of natural resource policy, agricultural research institutions, and food systems. He has worked as a researcher in sustainable development for the UNDP, IFPRI currently, and has been a consultant on projects related to food systems and rural poverty for numerous UN agencies. Okay, Ryan, over to you. Thanks. Are we having issues sharing? There we go. Okay, cool.
Sorry, I had problems just clicking mute. It's been a while. Thanks, Jonathan. Can you hear me clearly?
Yes.
Okay. Thank you very much for the introduction. And you did a little bit of lifting there, so I'll be quite brief here. I'm just going to talk about some of the research we've been engaged in that Jonathan introduced, and really kind of the first part, which is a review and some of the data we collected from 3 different cases. And this is drawing on an article that I'll provide the citation for at the end. And we really started, as Jonathan mentioned, we still don't know that much, and we quickly realized this is a pretty important topic, and there's a lot of interest on MSPs and transboundary waters, but there's not that much sort of practical guidance. And so we really wanted to kind of have 2 different things. On the one hand, a more analytical, research-based approach, which started looking around the question of what is the governance function of MSPs in relation to existing state-based formal organizations. So you can think of river basin organizations, RBOs, as those state-based formal organizations. We also wanted to understand sort of what is the value and for whom. That's maybe a question for a later time. And then from that research process, try and develop some highly informed guidelines or practical lessons for other basins interested in designing MSPs. And we discovered that they're more pronounced in the transboundary context. And so there's a lot of research on MSPs in natural resource governance generally, but in terms of a transboundary context, it's pretty interesting given a sort of principal agent problem. And that is that in RBOs, member states are representing the citizens of their countries, but the RBOs themselves have a basin-wide or transboundary mandate. And so having an MSP might allow them to do a bunch of different functions for governance, like sharing information or facilitating cooperation across those member state boundaries. And so this sort of scalar disjuncture makes MSPs quite important in this case. So we started by looking at river basin organizations that have MSPs. And as Jonathan mentioned, we still don't know how many, but we found some pretty interesting cases. And then we conducted key informant interviews with managers and directors of those RBOs that have stakeholder engagement. And we again quickly found that MSPs can serve a fundamentally different governance function than RBOs, but it depends on the place and design. And those place and designs differ quite widely. These are the three organizations we focused on. The first being the Nile Basin Discourse. And Jonathan mentioned Sylvester, engineer Sylvester Matemu is here from the Nile Basin Discourse. Then the Mekong River Commission, which is the RBO in the Mekong Basin, and ZAMCOM, the RBO in the Zambezi. So a quick definition in the article, we define MSPs as the institutionalization of integrating multi-scalar and multi-sectoral stakeholder voices and interests over time into river basin governance. And we have it as a sort of umbrella term for other multi-stakeholder forums or processes or dialogues. Although I would flag the keyword at the beginning, institutionalization, meaning that an MSP is really sort of part of something that doesn't just take place for a specific event or phenomenon, but is really there for the long term and has some sort of formal backing. The value of MSP, there's a lot here, and I'm not going to go through too much detail because I'm sure we'll talk more about it. I do think that last one, information sharing upstream and downstream, is something that really is important, given the ability of RBOs to engage directly with stakeholders. So it's not maybe a more inefficient process of going through member states, but allowing information sharing that's happening like river flows or natural disasters, but also learning from stakeholders and collecting information directly from them. So the three basins, as I mentioned, that we found quite a bit of variation in terms of the approaches of these three basins. The first being more state-based in the Mekong. And here, stakeholder voices and participation is channeled or filtered through national governments. So the member states themselves of the Mekong River Commission, they determine which stakeholders can participate in basin-wide stakeholder engagement. And this is done through several different activities, but primarily one is an annual basin-wide stakeholder forum. And so the member governments or the member states will determine which stakeholders from their country will go to participate in that. They do have a stakeholder engagement strategy, so I encourage you to look at that if you're interested. And there's really a lot on some of their achievements. I mean, one of the hallmarks that they claim is inclusive development, and this is around a lot of infrastructure projects to ensure that stakeholders are involved in decision-making of those specific projects. The second one being the Nile Basin here, we call it a semi-autonomous MSP, and engineer Matemu will probably talk more about this specific context here, but there's actually two different organizations. One, the Nile Basin Discourse, which is an NGO, and the other, the Nile Basin Initiative, which is the RBO. And so they work together through a memorandum of understanding, but they're autonomous organizations. So they work differently. They have different mandates and different funding structures. The Nile Basin Discourse is the MSP, and it's funded primarily by international, or almost exclusively, I think, by international donors. They also have, I encourage you to look at their website, really fantastic resource. And I mentioned one of their achievements as normalizing relationships between transboundary communities. That's really selling it short. There's a whole bunch of amazing projects that they've engaged in really facilitating cooperation in specific communities on different borders throughout the basin. And lastly, the Zambezi Basin, and here we determined it to be more of an RBO-based MSP. So this is through ZAMCOM, the RBO in the basin, and they really initiate, finance, and manage all of the stakeholder engagement activities, or the MSP. They have sort of a two-tiered structure where at the national level, each of the countries of the Zambezi Basin has their own MSP that is organized through ZAMCOM, and then those together constitute a watercourse or a basin-wide MSP, also managed by ZAMCOM. And one of their achievements is rules and procedures for data and information sharing. Also, again, I can't talk too much given the time, but you could Google that exact term for ZAMCOM and find their document on it. It's really pretty interesting what they're doing for information sharing. So this, I'm not going to go through all of this, of course. This is just sort of some of the fine-tooth information on all of the different basins. You can see on the left some of the specific details. And this is in the article with a lot more information and description on what all these mean. But just some high-level considerations. So given the diversity in the approaches of each of these MSPs, we also wanted to highlight some of the key considerations that hopefully inform some of the design features. The first one is that funding modalities vary across MSPs. I think that might have been somewhat evident as I walked through each of them. It could be the RBO that facilitates funding from the member states, international donors, often both. So, it's sort of a mix of different funding sources that will finance MSP activities. Also, diversity in the modalities for internal stakeholder interaction. So here, these are stakeholders, across the basin, and how could they interact with each other? I mentioned in the case of the Mekong, the in-person forums that they have annually. That is also the case for the other two basins. So this is probably the most common modality for internal stakeholder interaction. However, the participation and the availability of stakeholders to participate in that forum varies between each of those basins. Also, informal groups, so things like WhatsApp groups for maybe a specific project or a specific area of the basin, or a specific interest group like water or in the environment. These are informal, but I think, there's the ability to start formalizing them. Okay, thank you, Jonathan. I'm just ending. Next, diversity in modalities guiding interaction between MSPs and RBOs. I think that was kind of evident. Mekong being state-based or more decentralized, so each of the member states filtering the stakeholder involvement. More centralized in the case of the Zambezi, where everything is managed through the RBO. And then in the case of the Nile, an MOU, so two separate organizations working together. The core stakeholders are fairly consistent, and so I don't need to go into too much detail here. This is just all of the different stakeholders in each of the basins seem to be quite consistent. Importantly here that I didn't mention is the government participation. So I did mention member states, but of course there's also municipalities, different ministries at the national level. And so there's really a lot of government representation here that's important, that doesn't necessarily go through directly the member state themselves at the RBO, depending on their board. And key achievements, and I can't really talk too much about that. We'll get into that, I'm sure, in the panel discussion. There's the article that this is really based on, this presentation. Feel free to reach out to me directly. There's my email. I'd be happy to send you a copy. And we have another one coming out that's much more general, hopefully in the next couple of weeks. Thank you, Jonathan. Back to you.
Yeah, thanks, Ryan. So just a couple notes as we transition on to our next speaker. So there is a chat now coming through in the chat. So I just want to remind everybody participating, it looks like we've grown to more than 110, which is good. Feel free to fire away in the chat, and then presenters can react there. So that's one point. Second point, yeah, so you heard me at the outset highlight how we don't know how many MSPs there are in shared waters. So just to contextualize Ryan's effort a bit, so we did identify 3. Presumably there's a lot more than those 3. So that effort which Ryan made to kind of synthesize the diversity of MSP designs or models across those 3, that's one of the first efforts of its kind. So these lessons which he's highlighting are some of the first efforts towards that end. So they provided a valuable sort of input into the design of the INMACOM MSP, and then they can serve that role potentially elsewhere as well. Okay, with that, let's go on to our next presenter. Sindy Mthimkhulu. So Sindy Mthimkhulu is a water governance expert with extensive experience and leadership in the water resource management sector. She assumed the role of executive secretary of the Incomati Maputo Watercourse Commission recently, I think in August of this year, so 2 months or 3 in that role. INMACOM is an organization established to promote cooperation and sustainable management of shared water resources among Eswatini, Mozambique, and South Africa. Prior to her current role as Executive Secretary of INMACOM, she was the founding Chief Executive Officer of the Joint River Basin Authority Project board in Eswatini, where she was instrumental in strengthening the country's river basin institutions and advancing integrated water resource management. Okay, great. Thank you very much for joining us, Sindy. Over to you.
Thank you very much, Jonathan. I hope I'm audible. Greetings all. Sindy Mthimkhulu has introduced. I'll be taking you through what we have done in the Incomati in relation to MSP. As Jonathan briefly talked about the Incomati and Maputo Watercourse Commission, we were formed through an establishment agreement in 2021, and this is in line with the SADC protocol on shared transboundary watercourses, where we are advocating for collaborative approaches to managing water resources. Our mandate is to ensure equitable and sustainable management of the shared waters in the Incomati and Maputo basins. And we also are a 3-member state gathering, as already mentioned, and we are able to coordinate the cooperative management of transboundary water resources, and we also have to mobilize resources, but we also need to provide a voice so that shared interest can be, we can provide a platform for talking about issues that are of common interest between the 3-member states. So Jonathan has talked about the location of the Incomati. We are covering both the Incomati and Maputo, but zeroing in on the Incomati, it has quite a number of stakeholders, a population of 2.3 million people, 46,800 square kilometers, and also a river that's 450 kilometers long. And we host a number of important stakeholders in our basin, like power generation. We have Eskom and the Maguga. We have large-scale irrigation. We have large sugar production, both in South Africa, in Mozambique, and also in Eswatini. We have mining. We have forestry. We also have nature, the Kruger National Park, and we also have special economic zones like the Maputo Development Corridor. It's part of us. So all those stakeholders need to really find their way and find their voices somewhere within INMACOM so that we make sure that we manage the water resources to their interest as well. So we have mechanisms of dealing with decentralized water management in the 3 countries. In South Africa, there's the IWMI, which oversees stakeholder engagement through quarterly meetings in sub-catchments. In Eswatini, the Joint River Basin Authorities Project Board, where I used to be, has been established as the platform to engage stakeholders on water issues. But to reach people on the ground, we go through the Tingundla system where we get the community level through traditional structures. In Mozambique, Arasul also does that, and they have meetings at least twice in a year where they meet with their stakeholders. But that wasn't enough in the transboundary context, because while stakeholders are talking in country, it's important for them to talk at the transboundary level. So INMACOM needed to find a platform where we could talk to our people and share whatever we're learning and also get them to influence whatever we are doing. So this MSP will serve as an important governance mechanism which will ensure the stakeholder participation in decision-making so that we have equitable and effective governance of water management, and also we cooperate with all our stakeholders. And most importantly, we want legitimacy and buy-in of our activities and programs so that they are successful. And also we want to promote compliance. If people know what you are doing, then they will work with you to try and ensure that they adhere to your pronouncements. We also realize there's lots of local knowledge and we need to make informed decisions based on information gathered from the people who really know and live the situations. And in that way, we will really trust and be transparent. We will trust each other and be able to do things better. So when we were designing the MSP, we had some sessions where, of course, we looked at documents that are there. They've already mentioned sharing, learning from other MSPs, and also fostering key discussions within existing platforms where people are already talking about water management. In our case, the REMCO, there's a cooperation platform between the 3 member states where, from a technical level, they've already been talking about how they share lessons and they try to do best practice. So basically, we wanted this to provide this structured and a formal mechanism where we could channel the voices of the non-government people, because INMACOM is about governments, 3 governments coming together, but the non-government people also need to have their voice here. And the way we have set this up is that the government and the entities established have a committee where they discuss regularly, and then later on there's a forum where the broader stakeholder base comes in. So in terms of our organogram, basically, the 3 member states already had an organogram that recognized that information should flow to the lower level, the operational level, where our operators, the RSOs and GRBAs are. So in this platform, we've brought them together and we've identified them, and they would meet twice in a year as a committee to discuss issues of common interest. But beyond that, we also want to reach the people, which is now the general stakeholders, the academia, and other people who are not in government, to be able to talk about this. So the key responsibilities would be to meet twice a year as the committee, and for the forum to meet once a year, provide advice to the water management institutions, communicate the outcomes of those meetings from stakeholders and share that with INMACOM, and also advance urgent decisions for our attention as INMACOM. And we will undertake biannual stakeholder engagement, and we'll have reports from these platforms coming in. So there'll be me as the executive secretary convening these activities. Then there are the stakeholders who will be working with a stakeholder and communication specialist within our company. And then there'll be all the members who are attending meetings and sharing the information for us to be able to know how to proceed. So in terms of the funding, we have incorporated this MSP into our GF8 project, which started this year. So the project will engage the specialists. They will also fund programs from my office. They will also fund some activities. And we will still need to work together with the decentralized water management institutions to ensure that the biannual gatherings, which used to happen at REMCO, still happens and co-hosted by the member states and also the decentralized entities. So we are hoping to take forward what we started in REMCO. Lastly, this has been taken up very well. It was presented to the technical task team meeting in July, and we will continue to use the platform that was existing to continue taking forward this. And we are collaborating with REMCO, for example. This year we are having a REMCO conference in Mozambique, 3 to 7 November, and already you can see the logo of INMACOM as the Transboundary Commission has been built in there. We are working together, we are funding things, we are making the program together, and we're also supporting the delivery of the program. So it has really been a good exercise, and we have learned so much. And with that, thank you so much, Jonathan. This is what our experience has been in the INMACOM space. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks a lot, Sindy. A great presentation. It was really good to see the journey over the last 2 or 3 years of MSP development there. Okay, great. So and I should remind everybody before we move into the panel that I'm seeing the claps, which reflects a lot of interest, but feel free to put questions for Sindy in the chat, and the discussion can keep going there. In the meantime, let's move on to the panel discussion. Can I ask the panelists to turn on their camera as I introduce them, starting with Dr. Loreen Katiyo. Loreen is a transboundary water governance and environmental specialist at the Global Water Partnership Southern African Office, providing technical leadership on the delivery of the Transboundary Global Environmental Facility, GEF International Waters Project portfolio. And you just heard Sindy refer to one of those projects in the portfolio just a couple minutes ago. Okay, second, Patience Mukuyu. Patience Mukuyu is a policy expert currently leading WaterAid's global policy work on water security and climate resilience to improve access to water supply, sanitation, and hygiene services for all. Patience's work plays a pivotal role in shaping strategies and policies that advance equitable access to water to enhance climate resilience. And third, Engineer Sylvester Matemu. Engineer Sylvester Anthony Matemu is an expert in transboundary water resource management and cooperation. He is former executive director of the Nile Basin Initiative Secretariat and currently is a regional manager of the Nile Basin Discourse, which is a regional network of more than 600 NGOs. Nile Basin Discourse supports communication between citizens and governments and acts as a knowledge capacity sharing platform for stakeholders within and across the 10 Nile Basin countries. Okay, great. So we have about 28 minutes. Let's have some interesting discussion. All right, let's pick a first one. You heard Ryan earlier talk about some of the achievements of MSPs. If I ask Sylvester, who's now coordinating the Nile Basin Discourse, if there's a skeptic out there that wonders what do MSPs or transboundary MSPs, what's the real value add? Can you talk about some of the tangible contributions of transboundary MSPs, in particular the Nile Basin Discourse? Thanks.
Yeah, thank you, Rihanna. I'll be very brief. NBD is 22 years now of existence, and we have been working with the Nile Basin Initiative, and our activities are linked. We are working hand in hand with the NBI, and one of the all three of the activities that I can mention as evidence is a platform for cooperation, and because the government has trust. Remember, this civil society organization, MSP, has a trust. It is supported by the countries, so accessibility and the link up with the grassroots level is guaranteed.
Okay.
For platform for cooperation, we have strengthened the NDF at all levels up to the grassroots level. Also to take their voices.
Sorry, Sylvester, do you want to define that for people that are maybe not familiar with NDF? Now, could you repeat that?
The national, according to our structure, we at the regional level, we call Nile Basin Discourse at the regional entity, and under the Nile Basin Discourse, we have the national discourse forums, at every country, and these are the ones that trickle down to the grassroots level, to the communities, and we can link up like what Sindy have said, the local communities, etc. On platform for cooperation, then we meet directly with the grassroots levels. We get their views in terms of projects, whether they get benefit, whether they understand what the government is talking about at the national level, and then we'll take it up to the regional level. But another thing is all about the flood and the drought mitigation. Yeah, you know, river basin organizations have networks for monitoring, they collect information, they have models and so on. But what are the benefits? Do they know exactly what is this helping them in terms of agriculture, in terms of forecast and so on? So we educate them, they understand, and they take measures. But the other is all about gender, youth, and women, because they are part and parcel on issues of water resources management. We must give them a space, and their input, we take them at all two levels up. But also the issue of communication, we do the popular version, because some they do not know the languages, either French or English. So we make sure that we customize those at their level so that they can confidently give their views. Those views help to influence the decision making. Thank you.
Okay, good. No, that's great. I have at least 4 or 5 bullets there, I think, that reflect some of the key contributions of the Nile Basin discourse in the Nile. That's great. Let me just transition over to Loreen, and maybe ask a slight reformulation of the same question, but just reframing it a bit more broadly. So, we heard about the experience of the Nile from Sylvester just now. If I could ask you a bit more broadly, Loreen, about the value proposition of MSPs. For example, what are the benefits? What benefits have you seen in basins with MSPs versus those without? Is that something you could talk a bit about for a minute or two? I know you're working a lot working in several key Southern African river basins, some with MSPs, some without. Is that something you could add a few points on? Thanks.
Thanks, Jonathan. Yeah, I think the idea I'm bringing to the table is that MSPs are actually, we should view them as processes and not necessarily as, let's say, events or, I don't know, part of a governance structure. Yes, it's governance, but it's governance that's reflecting processes of taking ownership of making these stakeholders front and center of initiatives and management that's happening in a particular context in basins. So obviously, when that is institutionalized, when that is acknowledged and institutionalized, then the resources will flow in the direction of that institutional structure. And you then find that we're in a context where MSPs are actually institutionalized and are acknowledged and are budgeted for, then there will be the benefits that will accrue. In terms of some of the concrete results would be when you look at the national level, the transboundary level, and the regional level, the idea is what is being planned as policy at the regional level should be able to filter down to the national level, to the local level, because action happens at the local level and then aggregates to inform policy at the regional level. So in our experiences, Global Water Partnership Southern Africa are supporting regional dialogues, the SADC regional dialogue, which is some kind of MSP, which I think is something I can revisit later. Where you have river basins that, like SAMCOM, that has been used as an illustration in this case, that are structured to speak to the regional framework of MSPs, then you find that even it's easier for ICPs to then put resources into a structure which is endorsed at the regional level, at the basin level. So I think for me, one of the key aspects is that aspect of structure, formalized structure, having a formal structure that then attracts resources.
Okay, good. So I like that. And now Loreen introduced the role of scale, so then a lot of the MSPs that are the focus of the discussion today were envisioned to be like transboundary MSPs, applying to transboundary basins, like the ones Ryan referred to, like Zambezi or Mekong. But then Loreen is also highlighting that there's a role for regional ones, like, for example, in the SADC region, a sort of mechanism to foster stakeholder engagement there. So that's great. Another wrinkle on that one is national or in-country MSPs. So it's possible to go at a regional level, which is above the basin. It's possible to work at the basin, and then it's possible also to work in countries. So with that, I might direct one question to Patience. Maybe if you'd like to talk about the role for an organization like WaterAid in this. So as I understand, WaterAid mainly operates within countries, at a country level or within countries. And I think we heard Sindy, when she was talking, she referred to several in-country MSPs in the Incomati, the IUCMA, for example, I think in South Africa. So there's in-country MSPs, and then there's potentially transboundary ones, and then also regional ones. let's see. So directing a question to patients, do you work with MSPs in countries? And would you like to offer any thoughts on aligning in-country MSPs with cross-country ones? How do you do this efficiently, operate with MSPs across scale? Is this potentially MSP overload, to talk informally, or can things be managed effectively? Patience, over to you.
Thanks, Jonathan, and greetings everyone who's watching us. Maybe I'll just start off from where Loreen said. She said something very interesting, that actions happens at the local level, where then it aggregates to the basin level. So as WaterAid, we work with local communities, and those MSPs can manifest in different forms, as long as you have different stakeholders coming together to talk about a shared resource like water. I would like to believe that that constitutes something that's similar to an MSP. So we work at village committee level, where we try to build capacity with local water users on how to manage their own water, read their surface water flows, their groundwater levels, rainfall, and so on, just to understand within their own context what is happening with their water. And then we link their issues and their needs with sub-basin management committees that are then able to make sub-basin water security plans that take into account all these localized issues and challenges. And then these are then taken up into a more basin level plan, so to speak. So I really like what Loreen said about the local level impact that is then felt at the more transboundary scale. So what we have seen that has worked for us as WaterAid is to build capacity right at the local level, to understand what the actual issues are with relation to water resources management, because inclusive participation, which is what MSPs facilitate, is a central piece of water resources management. So we try to make sure that at the very local scale, we have inclusive participation of women, men, youth, and so on, and make sure that all their issues and needs are taken into account at the local scale, and further on as we go up into basin plans, allocation plans, and so on. So we have seen this as something that has really yielded results in terms of our data being used to make basin level decisions. But of course, there are challenges along that chain which still needs to be strengthened. For example, you'll find that a lot of this work depends on those formalized structures and institutions. So if you don't have, if you have a weak link somewhere, then you also lose that chain of coordination up to the basin scale. And in most cases, we see that having that chain depends on local champions that are part of ministries, for example. And if that person leaves their job, then that sort of stalls for a while and we lose that link. So it's quite, we've seen that it's quite important for us to maintain strong champions who understand the importance of linking local level action to basin level multi-stakeholder platforms, and then decision making and so on, and keeping that intact in the long run. I hope I've answered your question.
Yeah, no, that's great. And I love, it wasn't in my list of questions, but you're bringing out the role of informal actors, which I think is an interesting thread. And maybe the other panelists want to comment on. Maybe if I could start with Sylvester. So interestingly, Patience used the word challenge, which I like. It's always interesting to talk about some of the challenges or bottlenecks. But then she also talked about informal actors and the role of the informal. And I think that's something Loreen feels passionately about. But let's start with Sylvester. Would you like to offer any sort of reaction on that, to that point?
Yeah, it is a very, the issues of water resources management in particular, when you are from the multi-stakeholder platforms and the government policies and so on, there must be a well-structured coordination and trust among those partners. That is really very key. And as you know, the grassroots level, the local people are the ones that live in the watersheds. And access, whoever accessing those watersheds must get permission from the government, because you must undergo the bureaucratic process of the government. And it is very, very important to make sure that there is a very strong and well coordinated, there must be a very good structure to make sure that the focus, vision, and mission in terms of addressing the challenges and the difficult within that area of integrated water resources management, we have the same vision. In that regard, there must be a complementarity on what the government is doing, because the issue of water is the national security. It's tied up in other countries as the national security. And therefore, the government must put all measures to check and balance and make sure that you do not cause any confusion among the citizens that are there. But with these multi-stakeholder platforms, working together alongside and supported by the governments, really we can achieve that kind of a vision and managing the water resources management within the watershed. Thank you.
Okay, good. So I'll, if it's okay, bypass asking for Loreen's perspective on this issue, because I think there's a few other threads I'd like to shed light on. So I'd like to go to Loreen next, but I'd like to ask a different question. So far, it seems like we're identifying a lot of contributions, a lot of value from transboundary MSPs on their own, and also as key linkages with the local and regional level. So it seems like there's a number of key contributions. The role for the informal actors also is key. So if we have all these great contributions, then why is it we still find a number of transboundary basins that lack MSPs? Why are these transboundary MSPs flying under the radar? From a researcher analytical perspective, we don't seem to have like a global inventory of these things. What's going on here? Why don't we know more? Why are there not more MSPs? Loreen, would you like to offer any sort of perspective on that one?
Okay, thanks for that question. I think I might start with the controversial statement, which is actually that they are MSPs in all the basins. It's just that they are not documented, and then they are not also by definition. So by definition, they are not categorically fitting into what you, for example, in the framework that Ryan just presented. And that's because of the barriers, the barriers. So why did I make that statement about their MSPs? If we look at what I initially said, that it's about processes, it's about structure. And it speaks to what Sylvester and Patience have just said, that especially Sylvester, that we need structure, we need some kind of formal endorsement for processes. So if you go into the basins, you actually see that there is something happening at the local level, at the national level. But the question is it trickling to the transboundary level? And is it being identified, and is it formalized? So the barriers there include that lack of structure and institutionalization, which then makes it go under the radar. The other barrier would be resources, because if there is no commitment of resources to actually, facilitate these processes, they will either die out or they are not identified. And then they don't inform the broader governing structure. And then there's the issue of sovereignty, political aspects, where you actually do have maybe at the local and national level processes which are ongoing, which are multi-stakeholder by definition, but they do not aggregate to the transboundary level because it's not facilitated. There's that disconnect. There is no link there. And it may be that the more formal framework has, let's say, technical working groups. Sindy presented a structure, the INMACOM ES, where she was speaking about the the technical working groups as well as part of that. So you find that along the way, some of the, let's say, stakeholders that one, if you would go into the basin and map, because they are not fitting comfortably into the formalized structure, then those aspects fall off. So yeah, it's a question of resources and acknowledgement in terms of when it's formalized, resources flow into a formal structure. And then there's actually a budget that is put in place for convening this forum once a year, twice a year, as the case may be. But yeah, I think it comes back to why we are actually having this webinar and the role that IWMI does in terms of identifying this fluid, let's say MSPs, because there's a lot of fluidity and a lot of lack of classification or categorization of certain processes that are ongoing, but what one might actually conclude to say these are MSPs, but they just need to be coordinated, which is what Sylvester said, and institutionalized to ensure that there is flow into the let's say the formal framework of eliciting inputs and ownership from stakeholders.
Yeah, okay, great. That's an interesting response. Yeah, so in a few cases, I've been told categorically, no, there's no MSP by certain executive secretaries, as we talked about. But I like your perspective that it may be that there's kind of like an informal MSP. And so they're saying, no, there's no formal MSP, but in fact, implicitly, there is something informal that's already brewing that can be built on. Okay, we have a few minutes left. I would like to maybe direct the conversation back towards patients, if that's okay. Let's see. So then Loreen just flagged a few points. I'm sure patients, you'd like to pick up on some of them, the informal aspect in particular, and the source of finance. I think the financing aspect was there. But then also, I think an interesting aspect is this sustainability or maintenance thread. So after you create an MSP, do they typically sustain themselves, and or what needs to be considered to achieve sustainability? Would you like to offer any reactions on that front, patients? Thanks.
Thanks, Jonathan. I think already what has been said is around resourcing, and I agree. For you to have anything sustainable in terms of even the administrative tasks that have to be done within an MSP, you do need resources. But I would also like to think that having a clear understanding of the kind of water risks that are prone, that a basin is prone to, are critical to first find out within a basin, and those can actually give a drive to the stakeholders to want to participate. So if the roles of each stakeholder are clear in what they contribute to the solution of these water risks and how they contribute to even the problem itself, then it might be a clear way to sustain conversations and dialogues within the MSP. So even though there might be resources for them to meet regularly, if the agenda is not strong enough to keep them interested, they might not stick around long enough to make it something meaningful. And I think it's also important to build capacity in those other parts of the stakeholders. There are power dynamics in all MSPs, and maybe Loreen and Sylvester can speak more to this in terms of how those power dynamics are actually managed, where you have stakeholders who have a stronger voice than others, and then those ones that are often left behind, how do they manage that? Because then if you have an MSP that is not really addressing the needs of the most vulnerable, then what role really is it serving? So having that kind of capacity building is where maybe civil society organizations like WaterAid kind of play a role in building that capacity from the grassroots and try to make sure that their voice is represented at the basin scale. I think that's what I would say in terms of sustainability. Informal actors, maybe non-state actors, is what maybe how Sylvester would put it. So those are, maybe I would probably want to phrase it around a question to Ryan, perhaps, because when and even Sindy, I noticed that in the MSPs that are there, they're actually designed around ministries of water. What does that mean for other ministries like energy, food, and so on? Where do they fit? And what does that mean for overall sustainability, having all other sectors together in there?
Okay, Ryan can fold that into his closing remarks. I like it a lot. I think I have time for one last question. And I'm going to try to pull out the most sensitive one on the list to stir it up in the last 2 minutes here. And I'm going to direct it to Sylvester. So I think Sylvester has a really unique vantage point in that he's the head of an MSP, and he was previously the head of a river basin organization. And I know something that's come out with various conversations is that striking the balance between MSP and RBO is not always seamless, and that there can be potentially, say, friction, which can occur in terms of clarifying mandates of one versus the other. So with that in mind, I wonder if you could talk to that point in 2 minutes or less, Sylvester. Was that a precise question here? How do MSPs leverage RBOs in a complementary rather than duplicative way? Over to you, Sylvester.
Yeah. Thank you very much. Remember that the RBOs are the funds of the government, the sovereignty countries. I said earlier the issues of water in the river basin organizations are tied up with the political area and then the technical. So the issue of sovereignty is the one that influences. Therefore, the MSPs must show importance in terms of complementing towards the vision and mission of the RBOs and connected to the countries. So the countries must have a confidence on the platform, on the MSP. And in that regard, the RBO and MSP must have arrangement or a kind of MOU or whatever on how to complement and mobilize joint resources to make sure that they move in the right direction. So this is really very key, and that the MSPs must like now on the NBD side, we are leading now the in terms of doing on advocacy only, because the MSP is like voices and so on. Now we are working on the citizen-led data science. You bring science and the indigenous knowledge together to make value to advance towards solving, having joint solutions in terms of the climate hazards and so on. So with this kind of thinking and focus, then the governments will have confidence on MSPs and give attention to whatever they bring to the table for discussion. And that is the sustainability actually to complement what the government and the river basin organizations are doing. Thank you.
Okay, great point. Okay, now I want to pass it to Ryan. If Ryan, you could turn on your camera and audio. And that was a good point, and I think it tied in with Patience's earlier point on sustainability and keeping people interested and engaged. I'll hand it over to Ryan to give us final words and close us out. Ryan, over to you. Thank you very much.
Yeah, thanks, Jonathan, and thanks everybody for the panelists and of course everybody here. I see we've had around 100 people attendees, so really fantastic event. And I have a very difficult job of, now I see I have a minute. Okay, jumping right into it. So I want to highlight two quick, I have 3 pages of notes and I've been trying to synthesize them. I hope everybody caught all the discussion, so my job is less important, but I think two sort of trade-offs. Formality versus informality. We've talked a lot about that here. I think there's benefits to both, and I think the MSP has a tough task of trying to navigate those. So ensuring informality so that there's more inclusion, but at the same time, formality so that the MSP can have buy-in and also be institutionalized by actors. There was a fantastic comment from Ms. Sindy and Mthimkhulu on this question with the governments being more formal and having legitimate partners versus, an MSP having a sort of diverse mandate. Second one, top down versus bottom up. So top down, again, this question of buy-in and ensuring that there's some sort of financing, but bottom up to ensure that there's inclusivity, a lot more there. 4 quick sort of interrelated themes. One on power dynamics, so balancing, national sovereignty but also different stakeholders and sectors within a transboundary context. Really difficult because there's so many people, very, very broad. Scale, very important here, also related to the power dynamics. Financing, which I think is key with not only the buy-in from formality, but also ensuring that there's some sort of value proposition here. And I think that was pretty clear. And lastly, this question on multi-sectoral, the importance of multi-sectoral representation. Engineer Sylvester's last comment there about knowledge and bringing together indigenous voices, I think, is key. So it's, again, this question of somewhat informality, but making sure that it's formal and across all these sectors. I see that I'm now out of time, so I had a lot more, but I just want to mention that we look forward to continuing this research by broadening the scope of understanding MSPs in the transboundary context and hopefully adding to these questions of what counts, and Dr. Loreen Katiyo's mention about, are they being implemented even if they're on paper, and sort of digging into that to understand much more about MSPs at scale at the transboundary level. So yeah, thank you all again for attending, and I think that closes us.
Yes. Thank you.
Great.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you all.
Thanks, everybody. Thanks again.
Okay.
Bye-bye.
Bye.